Matthew 18. Sometimes we look at it and we see, oh, well, they're just talking about rank, and that terrible Peter shouldn't have been thinking about how he could be first, and that we need to be last because the first is last, and be like children and humble and all these things. That's not really what I got out of chapter 18 this time when I studied through it. I think that living out the upside-down value system of the kingdom is fundamentally shown in our personal relationships with each other. And so when Peter asks, who is going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Jesus doesn't say, well, the one who does X, Y, and Z, right? He doesn't. It's the one who makes himself like a child. And so in our own lives, this entire chapter here is about personal conflict. Peter was trying to head off a conflict, right? Because in the 2 chapters previous, Jesus has foretold his death. Chapter 16, chapter 17, he's told them that he's going to leave them. He's going to die. Maybe they didn't hear the resurrection part, I don't know, but they thought he was leaving. They thought he was gone. And so this question might not be maybe as selfish as we think it might be. Peter might be just trying to provide for the group here. Who's going to be the next leader of the group, Lord? We know that John already died. We know that you're going to die. Who's going to be the next person to lead this group? And so there's going to be relational conflict. Every time there's a group of people together who with a common theme, there is going to be relational conflict. And there's going to be relational conflict within the church. Jesus says it right here in chapter 18. He even uses the word ecclesia that we translate into church. And so for Jesus, this teaching of forgiveness is the cornerstone of what it means to be a child of God. For Jesus, forgiving other people in relational conflict with you, forgiving other people when they wrong you is the hallmark. It is the stamp of approval. It is the stamp so that the defining feature of what it means to follow after himself. It's how he himself, it's how Jesus himself would lead his own disciples, is by forgiving them. It's how he would lead the entire world out of darkness, right, is by forgiving us even though we don't deserve it. And so this is one of those topics I think that some of us who have been believers for a long time, we're thinking, I'm glad I'm not harboring anything against anybody else in my heart, right? You know, I've been a Christian a long time. I'm pretty good at forgiving people, and so let me cause you some warning. By the end of this lesson, I want us to check in again, and I wanted you to check in again on that feeling once we explore some of the words of Jesus here in this lesson today. Because unresolved hurt and unresolved pain is a lifelong struggle in our existence, and it is a lifelong struggle for us to forgive people. And so let's look at the lesson this morning. I have an overview here. If you want to stop the video, you can look at this if you want to, or pause the video, but I'm not going to say anything more on this slide. I printed it out and handed it out to everybody here. So if you want to, you can pause. Let's get right into it, though, because I have a lot of slides, and I have a lot of words written in my notes in the slides. So I'm going to talk fast this morning, probably. So the disciples' question here in chapter 18 is about status. Who's the greatest, right? And Jesus responds by giving these instructions that they need to be like little children, right? So this is not really about adopting some supposed honorable characteristic of a child, right? Because children are not always humble, right? They're not always, interacting with each other in nice ways, right? Anybody who's had kids kind of understands those things. So these are not children are not always innocent. They do bad things. They're not always humble. They're not always receptive to suggestion from adults. They're not always trustworthy. And so that's not what this is about. This is not, when he says you need to be a child, it's not about those things necessarily. Maybe it is in part, but this is about accepting the low position on the social scale, the low position on the totem pole, which is like a child. That is the lowest position in any hierarchy of authority that exists is a child. In any sort of decision-making structure we have, children don't get to make those decisions. In movies, maybe, but not in real life. They are subject to, and they are wholly dependent on adults. Or, like we're soon going to see in chapter 18, they're wholly dependent on a shepherd. So, when we lower ourselves to the status of children and not trying to be better than our brothers, we are welcomed into the kingdom. Verse 4, whoever, that's the subject of the sentence, whoever then humbles himself as a child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus' comment here about the child, this child that he's brought in and he's using as a demonstration for everyone so they can see the child as an object lesson here. His comment about the child that he's brought in as an example is looking at how other people respect this child. They have no respect for this child because he's done nothing to be respected. And so it's going to really move us into the main area, the main topic that we're going to talk about this morning, and that is how the disciples should treat one another. How should we treat this child? Should we treat this child with respect? He's nobody. He shouldn't be in the decision-making structure. But here, Jesus says that this child is supposed to be welcomed, not simply as a child, as a nobody, but this child is supposed to be welcomed in Jesus' name, right? He says, one of these who welcomes this child in my name. And this implies that the child has value. This implies that the child represents Jesus, right? So that to welcome the child is to welcome Jesus himself. And so it's like this that Jesus gives us the least important person in the room, and he gives that person the most significance, so much so that it's out of proportion, it's out of whack with our human understanding of things. In simple terms, Jesus has put the last first. So the last is indeed first if we are children. And so, now that we've talked about little ones, we've talked about the example of a child, now we're going to talk about caring for those children. And we're going to move on to a different word. He's going to call these little ones or children. And here he's using a very similar word phrase that he uses in Matthew chapter 5. Let me just read it real quick. Matthew chapter 5, 29 and 30. Matthew chapter 5, verse 29 and 30. He says, "And if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it away from you. For it is better for you that one of the parts of your body perish than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you that one of your parts of your bodies perish than the whole body go into hell." He says almost the same exact thing here in chapter 18. He says almost the same thing again in Matthew chapter 13, where the stumbling that we're talking about here, the stumbling that's being imagined, is more drastic than just being offended. Being offended is popular these days. I mean, I could bump into you and you could be offended. And somehow that's part of Anyway, not going to go down that road. The stumbling that's being talked about here is not just being offended or even scandalized, which comes from the Greek word that it's translated from. That's not the meaning that's trying to be presented here. The stumbling here is a fatal harm to our relationship with God. If we trip one of the children of God so that they're in danger of falling out of the race altogether, there will be consequences on us. And so this is a serious danger here that demands extremely serious measures, whether we're talking about the punishment of the person responsible for it, or we're talking about the elimination of the source of the problem, right? The source of the sin ourselves. We need to remove it. Just like it says we need to remove our eye, and we went over this in class. Why does it help to not remove one eye? Because you have another eye that's going to do the same thing. So we know this is not literal language. We know this is highly figurative. So what's the context here? Let's back up and think about the context again. Because we're talking about caring for these little ones. We don't need to put stumbling blocks in the road. We don't need to scandalize these people, to put a snare in the way, to say, oh, well, I'm going to catch him doing that, and then it'll be all over for our relationship. That is exactly the wrong thing to do. In fact, Christ says if you do that, you're liable to the eternal fire. Eternal fire. A fire that is never quenched. What's the context here? When we don't control ourselves, when we don't submit to the adult's authority, that would be God here, or Jesus, we are in danger of a judgment that is worse than a drowning. We're in danger of an everlasting fire. Drowning would be preferable. A minute or two and you're done, right? And so I want to be very frank with everybody here this morning. This is not a topic that I enjoy. It's not a topic that I'm very good at talking about, but it is a topic that Jesus primarily talked about. The word Gehenna, that's translated hell here, is used 13 times in the Bible. 12 of those were used by Jesus. It's a serious issue that we need to talk about. And so hell is a very real punishment. And in this case, we can see both the duration of it, right? It's everlasting. And we can see how terrible it is. It's fire. Fire hurts. And if you put the two together, it hurts forever. So we have two motivations that are given so far in the story about why we should come back to God, why we should forgive our brother, why we should not have conflict in the community. One's positive, right? That God has forgiven us, and so we should forgive others. Jesus, though, more than any other, he taught the reality of an eternal place of suffering and torment. And this is not the only place. Like I said, there's 12 other places, there's 11 other places you can go and look for this particular word, for Gehenna. Matthew chapter 25 is probably the most obvious. Matthew chapter 25 in verses 40 through 46, right in that area. And so we need to take sin seriously. So much so that we remove whatever is close and dear to us if it causes us to sin. Jesus, he's using hyperbole here, right? But it doesn't help us to only pluck out one eye. I know I just said that, but I want to say it again. It doesn't help us to pluck out one eye because we've got another eye. Sin is like a cancer. And so sometimes we have to do radical surgery. And radical surgery might be the only solution. We mentioned a couple examples this morning, and I'm not going to mention names, but in my own life, let me use an example, and I just advised a friend this week that he should, as a preacher, he should never use examples from his own life. You should always use parables or something like that because it's just not wise. But I'm going to use an example from my life. I had a problem with a lot of things before I came to Alaska. One of them was my own speech. Cursing was a problem. Drinking was a problem. And so these things, I had to cut them out. I had to do radical surgery. I had to remove myself from the situations and friendships that I had and distance myself so that I could wholly commit myself to God. And that's like cutting off your hand because I left behind everything that I knew and everybody that I knew. And so sometimes we have to do that radical surgery if we're going to care for ourselves. Now we're talking about caring for the little ones inside of a community. And so this idea of disciples as a community, these little ones, these children as a community continues here in verses 10 through 14. And to despise one of those little ones is the opposite of what we are supposed to be doing, the welcome that we are supposed to be giving them in verse 5. And whoever receives one of the child in my name receives me. It's the opposite. And so in verses 6 or 7, we see this possibility now that this little one might be caused to stumble and might be lost from this life that we have in our discipleship. And so these verses, they really underline how important and how serious this situation is. And this point is going to be made explicitly again here in verse 10. So that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that their angels in heaven continually behold the face of my Father who is in heaven. And it's going to be made again in verse 14. But let me just back up. This is emphasizing how much every single little one matters to God. How much you and I matter to God. And therefore, we should matter to our fellow disciples. So the imagery is a parable. The imagery that's being used here in verses 10 through 14 now is a parable of sheep, right? God is the shepherd. But verse 10 here really makes clear in our mind that these disciples are expected to reflect the mind of God as a shepherd, as a pastor who is going out into the field and how he cares for his sheep. And so it's the individual disciple who's expected to take those necessary actions there that we're talking about in the next section, in verses 15 through 17. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but what we're trying to do is ensure that God's concern for his sheep is implemented among his people. Between you and me, we need to care for each other and care for the sheep that goes astray the same way that God does. And so we have the privilege of God wanting us, that we as little ones matter to God, and we have priority because Jesus says to us that he rejoices more over one of us that went astray. So all of us have gone astray, obviously, in our own lives. And so Jesus rejoices over us. But again, let's back up and remember the context. We're living as a community, and so it matters how we treat each other. And there's multiple layers of application here, and it's just painfully obvious this past political season that we fall short of those goals. That we fall short of treating our brothers and sisters with dignity, even if they disagree with us politically. But what if they disagree with us spiritually? Or what if they disagree with us, and that's our spouse in our marriage? Well, that's next week in chapter 19. But if you don't understand chapter 18 and what it means to have discipline, and discipline in forgiving the same way that God forgave us, you'll never make it through chapter 19 because you won't understand it. You won't understand what it means when Jesus says those things about marriage. You'll be like the disciples who says, who can live up to this standard, right? All right, let's move into verses 15 through 17. And we'll get a little bit more of a bigger picture of what's going on. I'm not going to hit verses 15 through 17 very hard here because I have a lot more slides on the last section here of the chapter. But verses 15 through 17 is often used as a model for church discipline. And let me just say that this passage was never intended for church discipline. And it's not so obvious in English, but it is very obvious in the Greek because verses 15, 16, and 17, the you that is used here is all singular. And so this is how a disciple is supposed to act when he or she is aware that a fellow disciple is in spiritual danger through sin, right? And so this is a description of the practice of caring for the little ones, caring for the sheep. Verses 15 through 17 is a description of how that works, what it looks like, the practical application of those pastoral concerns that God has for the little ones, that Jesus demands of us in verses 11 through 14. And so this 15 through 17 here is, like I said, it's addressed entirely to the individual disciple. Even the you of verse 17 is singular, so that these verses are not about imposing community disfellowship. That's not what this is about. But this is about the attitude of the individual disciple who first noticed the problem. If we want to look at disfellowship and things like that, there's plenty of other places we can go, and we could even include this one as far as tone and maybe some different aspects of it. But this is not about, the intention of this verse is not about excommunication or disfellowship or whatever you want to call it. This is about how I treat my brother and ensuring his safety. Ensuring his safety. This is about the attitude of the individual disciple who first notices the problem. This disciple is there's a vision that's going on here. This disciple is envisioned as acting within the context of the whole community of disciples, but the focus is on the individual disciple's attitude and his action. So let's just back up. In a scripturally organized church, in a church that has leadership according to the scriptures with elders and deacons, it's easy for ordinary people, the lay people, if we want to put labels on people, to hide behind the authority structure, right? Oh, that's not my job. I'll go tell the elders, they'll take care of it, right? I don't have to do that. Well, that's not at all what this verse here is talking about. It's easy for us sometimes to hide behind authority structures or to leave it all to the hired person to do himself. And we sort of appeal to Cain even. Am I my brother's keeper? Am I supposed to be watching his life? You know, he's an individual. He needs to take care of himself, right? Our sort of comfortable assumption is that the answer must be no, right? I'm not my brother's keeper. But this passage directly asserts that the answer is yes. In a community of little ones, each little one must be concerned and take responsibility for the spiritual welfare and the spiritual well-being of our brother and our sisters. It's not all the job of the elders. Yes, it is the job of the elders, but it's not all the job of the elders. In fact, this verse says that it is your job if you notice it first. All right, let's keep going. And let's look about the bigger picture of dealing with sin in the community and dealing with forgiveness. Because so far we've seen Jesus tell us that we should be born again, right? We should be these new kinds of human beings. We should be like children, right? That's verses 1 through 6. We have seen Jesus tell us that as a newborn community, we're likely to hurt each other, right? As we grow and as we mature, right? That's verse 7 through 14. We're going to hurt each other. We're going to go astray like a sheep. And then he gave us some really good tools to use in verses 15 through 17 there of what to do when we hurt each other. Go to your brother. Take somebody with you because, maybe I'm just seeing things wrong. Maybe I'm in the wrong. And I need somebody to tell me that, I really just need to let it go because it wasn't anything. That wasn't really a big problem. He gave us those tools of knowing what to do when somebody hurts me, about conflict resolution. And so Peter comes up and says, hey, Jesus, let's get practical here. How many times? I mean, come on. It can't be. I mean, how much do I have to put up with is the question that's asked. How many times can this fellow disciple in our community, how many times can he wrong me? Is it 7 times? And I'm sure Peter thought he was being really generous, right? 7 times, that's a lot. It's God's number, it's wholeness, completeness. If he completely does all that, then it's completely over, right? I'm out of here. If it's a relationship, maybe a marriage or something, right? 7 times, I'm out of here. And I kind of answered this question already in the Bible class, but for those who are listening on the live stream, think about this. Let me ask you this Bible trivia question. What is the only other story in the Bible to use this language of 7 and 77 or 7 times 70 in the same context? There's only one spot in the Bible. Think about it for a second here. And while I talk about the translation difficulties, the word that's translated 7 and 77, or 7 times 70, is an idiomatic phrase for a lot. It just happens to include the word 7 in there, and so it's difficult to translate. Most newer translations translate it as 77. The King James and the New King James translate it as 7 times 70. It doesn't matter which way you translate it, because the only other time this same exact Greek word is used is in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 24. Genesis 4 and verse 24, and there's an interesting story there. I mean, here we are, the second generation after creation, and things have really gone downhill. By chapter 4 here, Cain is going to kill Abel. He's going to be sent out of the garden. So there's 2 brothers. One is jealous of the other. And what does he do in response to that jealousy, right? He kills his brother. And before he even kills his brother, though, I got everything all out of order here, sorry. Before he kills his brother, God talks to him and he says, be careful. This jealousy and anger and sin is like an animal, like a beast crouching at the door. Right? And God says to Cain that it's going to devour him if he doesn't deal with it. And he doesn't. And so he kills his brother, and he's banished from the garden, and he goes and he finds a wife, and he starts a city whose people do the same sorts of actions as him. A place you would never want to live, right? And so Genesis 4 describes that city by describing what the people of the city are like. Do we remember Lamech? Lamech took for himself 2 wives in chapter 4 and verse 19. He's the first person recorded in the Bible to do that. Lamech is a songwriter. He writes one of the first songs in the Bible. And he's a poet. Let's read his poetry. Adah and Zillah, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech. Give heed to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. This songwriter and poet is writing about how terrible he is, and he's proud of it. He's proud of how macho he is. A young man picks a fight with him, and so therefore he's justified to retaliate, right, in the world's eyes. And he sings, if Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. And so this is the story Jesus is alluding to. And to begin talking about forgiveness, he starts with a story that is anti-forgiveness. Lamech is proud that he's taken vengeance 77 times as worse as the person who picked a fight with him. And so Jesus says that the kingdom of God is a completely different deal, right? There is no limit to our forgiveness. We're different creatures. We are little ones. We are like Lamech, but not like Lamech. We're not like Lamech in the way that Lamech is part of the death spiral of violence and death in this world. We're like Lamech in the sense that we forgive and it doesn't matter what people do to us. Forgiveness is a sign of a new and different humanity. Forgiveness is a sign of a kingdom that it was supposed to be the inverse of Lamech, with the uncanny ability and will to forgive others no matter how much we are wronged. And so the parable here is about unlimited forgiveness, the parable of the unforgiving servant. The question always comes up, well, how much money does this? Well, the bottom line is we don't know. A talent, I've heard some people say that it is roughly equivalent to 20 years worth of wages. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. This guy owned 10,000 talents. That's 200,000 years worth of wages. He could not have worked it off even if he tried. He could not have done it. And so the talent is this enormous amount of money that people from this time period could not have even imagined. And 10,000 times that is the number that God has forgiven us. The servant then goes out, the forgiven servant goes out, and somebody owes him 100 denarii, or denarius. A denarius was 1 day's wage. About 4 months, a couple $1,000 maybe, is what this guy owed him. You know, maybe that's significant to some of us, but it's not exactly significant to 200,000 years worth of labor, of wages. It just isn't. And so forgiveness is a sign of a different humanity, a humanity that has been transformed into children. And so when we talk about forgiveness, I handed out this slide to everyone this morning. If you want to look at it, you can follow along, or you can follow along on the board behind me. There's a lot of misunderstandings that kind of come out of this text, and probably the biggest one that I've heard that comes straight out of the world's wisdom, not out of the Bible, is we need to forgive and forget. That is never in the Bible. Never in the Bible. We aren't supposed to hold on to grudges, that's correct, but we don't forgive and forget. We don't ignore the problem and hope it goes away. That's not how forgiveness works. And so the bottom line is that Jesus does not ask us to become a doormat. He doesn't say forgive and forget as many times as you want and just let them run over you. Jesus said in verse 15 that they needed to go do something, right? You needed to go to your brother, right? And I'm going to hit verse 15 like 100 more times because everything on this slide begins with verse 15 and going to our brother to try and work out the problem. We don't just ignore the problem. We go to our brother and work out the problem. We don't just forget the problem. We go to our brother and work out the problem. You see how that gets repetitive? But going to our brother and working out the problem is the hard part, right? Especially for those of us that don't like conflict. Right? He didn't say either that we all need to sit down and have a prayer meeting about it either, right? He said go to your brother and work it out. He didn't say forgive and forget. He said go work it out. He said go to them out of love for them as a child of God. Go to them out of love for your fellow members of the community. He's not asking us to suffer in silence, right? He wants us to go to our brother and work it out. And so when we put the previous instruction, right, together with this view of unlimited forgiveness, some people view that as conflicting. But there's no conflict there. What happens, though, is that Jesus' teachings become even more intense and personal, right? They demand an action of us. Can Jesus mean that we need to ignore or overlook when somebody wrongs us? Right? Forgive and forget. Love sees past all wrongs. You ever heard these phrases? That's nonsense. What does Jesus say is the first thing that we're supposed to do when somebody wrongs us in the church community? It's go to them. Love does not overlook. Love might cover over, but it does not overlook. And so Jesus even provides some of the first safe boundaries for those people who are being abused. Jesus says here that when you go back, you should always take somebody with you, right? Your first priority, according to verse 15 here, is to find help to regain stability and to provide distance and safety. And so if you are in a situation, please get help. Whether it's contacting me or somebody else, do not allow abuse to continue further. Find somebody who can help you regain stability and provide distance and safety so that you can begin the hard work of forgiveness, right? That hard work of forgiveness that has to come if you are a follower of Jesus. And I want you to notice something very clearly. I did not say reconciliation. I said forgiveness. Jesus is telling us to forgive, not to keep ourselves in a dangerous or abusive situation. Reconciliation is not under our control. We talked about this in the Bible class. It's not under our control. We cannot control the thoughts and the emotions and the will of another human being. Maybe they're dead. Maybe they moved on the other side of the world. Who knows? But that's not what forgiveness is about. That's what reconciliation is about, but that's not what forgiveness is about. And we're talking about forgiveness this morning. Forgiveness does not take two people. And this is very significant because look at verse 35. So shall my heavenly Father also do to you if each of you does not forgive his brother from your heart. Literally, your hearts. You all, if you don't forgive them from your hearts, you will suffer the same fate that they do for their sin. Forgiveness does not take two. And so where does Jesus say forgiveness takes place? It takes place Where is the root of forgiveness? It's in your heart. It's not in the person that you want to strangle and make them understand how terrible they made you feel. It's not in their heart, it's in your heart. So forgiveness is in the heart, but let's back up again. Let's back up again. Look at the big picture. Have you ever seen, all right, let me back up even further, because I forgot we need to hit this. Have you ever seen the word brain in the Bible? Have you ever looked for it? I'll give you a hint, it's not there. Mind is, but brain, mind is also an English translation of the inner being. So there's a caveat to that one too. So mind is there, but brain is not in either the Old Testament or the New Testament. And we need to realize that some of our 21st century thoughts and ideas, we sometimes impose those onto the scriptures because that's how we're raised. That's what we know. The problem is that's not how these people understood the way that we work as human beings. And so let's back up. Where do we as Americans view logic and choice as happening? I think Verna already said it. In our mind, in our brain. But I already said brain is not in the Bible. And so in the first century ancient Near East, which is the general area there of Israel and Palestine and the surrounding areas, you will not find that separation between the feelings and the logic part of our brain. You will not find that. It all happened in the heart. The heart was about choice and it was about feelings. And in 21st century America, we've separated the two. I feel in my heart and I have logic in my head. But you won't find that separation here on the pages of the Bible. The heart was the center of your emotions and your will. And what it means for Jesus when he says these things about the heart is that forgiveness is a choice that you make, that you begin to feel as you make the choice. Because forgiveness is not something that we're likely to want to do. But what does that look like? What does it look like? What does it look like to forgive? Well, it looks like this parable of the unforgiving servant, right? The unforgivingness, is that a word? It puts us, when we have that feeling in our body, it puts us into a frenzy, like that servant who didn't forgive the small debt. It puts us into a frenzy where we're looking for justice, or we want to retaliate, and it just consumes us to the point to where we don't want this person to apologize to us. We want to be proven right? I don't want my political opponent to apologize and say, I do agree with you. I want to be proven right. So what does the servant do? What does the servant do in the story here? He puts him into jail. He puts the guy who owes him money into jail. This was actually a common practice. What can the guy not do in jail? Can't make money to pay him back. Now, this was a way of extorting it, essentially, out of the family of the person. So the family, if they loved him enough, would bail him out by paying his debt. This is a story of Lamech sneaking out of the unforgiving servant. It is the death spiral of human history, right? The fact that I don't care if this guy pays me back, I want him to pay, right? That is the story of humanity. We want to put this person into an impossible situation so that they can know what they did to me and feel it and know how bad it was. And we have to refuse to put this person who has wronged us, we have to refuse in our own lives as Christians, we have to refuse to put this person in that impossible scenario. Because if we put them in that impossible scenario, we have ensnared them, which is the root word for the Greek word that's translated stumble. We have caused them to stumble if we put them in that impossible situation. And so now we see how forgiveness works. We can see how it works in the community and in interpersonal relationships. And now, as we move on to personal relationships here in this last story, we see how the basis of forgiveness is the basis for the teaching in chapter 19. And that if we don't forgive our spouse, we're no better than the heathen on the street. Now, like I said, this is not about staying in an abusive situation. That's not what this is about. What forgiveness is about, though, is about giving up my right to retaliate, right? It's about giving up my right to go and put a chokehold on the guy, right? Give me my stuff. I want it. Give me my toy, right? That's not the way it works. Forgiveness is about giving up that right, about challenging my own heart's attitude towards the offender. And this is on the back side of the page that I handed out. That we need to remember that God has forgiven us. That we need to rediscover that that person is a person. That they are a human being created in the image of God. And we need to offer compassion instead of hatred. And so the story of wrong being heaped upon wrong, it's on the first several pages of Genesis, but it's been written 500 bazillion times since the dawn of humanity, right? But Jesus says that the kingdom of God is here, and to enter it, you must be born again to be a new kind of human. In the kingdom, we do conflict differently, Jesus says. We give up our right to retaliate. We choose we choose to change our heart's attitude because of God's forgiveness for me. That is the message of this parable. And so this parable compares God's forgiveness to ours. And so it's because there is no limit to God's generosity to His undeserving creation that they in turn can claim a right. They cannot claim. The creation cannot claim a right to withhold forgiveness from our fellow man, from our fellow disciples. And so a community of the forgiven must be a forgiving community. I want you to stop for a second this morning. I really want you to look around in your mind's eye at the world around us. We live in America and we often think, the greatest country in the world. I mean, have you looked outside? There's people dying. There's people doing wrong things all around us. We live in Cain City. And the Lamechs of the world and the little Lamechs inside of all of us have created a mess. There's constant wars. There's constant people dying from horrible things that we do to each other. We have created this mess. And we owe zillions and billions and bazillions of dollars to the creator of our good and beautiful world, like this servant here does in the story. That creator who made human beings to reflect the beauty of his own image and the perfection of it. And look what we have done to the place. Look what we have done to each other in our relationships with each other. whether you want to start at home in our marriages, or whether you want to start in the community of believers in the church, look what we have done to each other. And so I'm here this morning to give a more stern warning than I usually give, because Jesus says it twice. If you allow the actions of other people to fundamentally undermine the teachings of Jesus on forgiveness, if you allow somebody else's actions to cause you to not forgive, then your soul is in danger this morning. Let me read verse 34. And his Lord, moved with anger, handed him over to the torturers until he should repay all that was owed to him. What can he not do when he's in the torturer's hands? Repay. He can't repay. But it's a final judgment. It's an eternal judgment, he says back in verse 8. And he says it's like a fiery hell. Verse 34 in the parable likens it not to a detention, right? The ESV translates this as jailer. That's not what we're talking about. This is a different word. This is a torturer. This is a painful punishment. Matthew chapter 25, verse 46, if you want to read more on it. But in the story, this happens immediately. Like the action happens, this happens. But God hasn't done that for us, right? But rather than enact revenge as soon as we do something wrong and just roast the place, right? God has come among us like the shepherd. He has left the flock. He has come among us in the person of Jesus. And in his death, he personally put onto himself. He personally shouldered the consequences for our sin. He took all of that evil. He took all of the sin, all of the ruin that we have put in the world, and he took it upon himself. And in his resurrection from the dead, he offers both forgiveness and reconciliation to God through his love. And so you can be released from those consequences of destroying his good creation. You can be released from that burden this morning if you will repent, if you will turn and make yourself like a child. If you need help doing that this morning, please contact us. You can, if you're on the internet, you can contact us via email, sitkachurch@gmail.com, or you can call my cell phone, 252-2141. That's the lesson for this morning. That's the very basis of the lesson for next week. In chapter 19, we'll look at Jesus' teachings not only on divorce, but the rich young ruler and some other things. I might have to divide it up into 2 lessons, but we look forward to seeing everybody here next week. All right, thank you, everybody.